to the second chapter of the book of Romans. Romans chapter 2. It was 16 weeks ago that we started our study of the book of Romans, and so far we have covered 32 verses. We've covered all 32 verses of the first chapter. We have been taking a very slow and methodical look at the epistle, taking the time when necessary to break down words and sentences and fleshing out the meaning that the writer originally intended. And tonight we're going to begin looking at chapter 2. And the thing that I want us to recognize is that chapter divisions, while they are helpful for our study, and especially when I say go to Romans chapter 2 or, Ephesians 2 or whatever, it's definitely helpful for you because you know where I want you to go. But chapter divisions were not added to the Bible till I believe the 1300s. Is that right? I'm looking to our resident scholar for his the nodding of approval. Again, I talk about things like that a lot. And chapter divisions were not a part of the original Bible. We know that. The Bible was not written in chapter and verse. It was written in full letters. Paul did not write 16 chapters of the book of Romans. He wrote the letter. In fact, he himself didn't even pen the letter. He dictated the letter and someone else hand wrote it for him. But it was all one letter. The reason why I mention this is because just because we begin a new chapter in the book of Romans does not mean that we begin a new context. Doesn't mean that we've left somehow chapter 1 behind and we're starting chapter 2 and it's all fresh and it's all new. No, that's not the case at all. The words of chapter 2 do not just appear out of nowhere, but they actually are dependent upon what we learned in chapter 1. In fact, if you look at chapter 2, the very first word of chapter 2 is the word therefore. That indicates that it's a tie-in to what came before. As I noted last week, the idea that Paul is expounding started up in verse 18 of chapter 1. Verse 18 of chapter 1 says these words, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." That's where the idea that Paul is talking about started. And in fact, if you wanted to be real technical, you could actually say that the idea began in verse 16 of chapter 1, where he says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, to the Jew first and then to the Greek." And verse 17, "For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith." The idea that Paul is expounding begins with the idea of the righteousness of God. Because what he says in verse 17 of chapter 1, he says the righteousness of God is revealed. And then in verse 18 he says the wrath of God is revealed. Why is the wrath of God revealed? It is because the righteousness of God has been offended. God's righteousness has been revealed, and God's righteousness was offended by our sin. Thus, as a result, the wrath of God is being revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. So that's where we begin. That's the thought. And the result, starting in verse 18 of chapter 1, is a decrescendo. You've heard me use that word a few times over the last few weeks. Is a decrescendo, a spiraling down, if you will, into sin. We see the phrase 3 times in chapter 1, God gave them up. God gave them up. God gave them up. And that phrase is a statement about the wrath of abandonment. People have rebelled against God, and in so doing, God has allowed them to go the way they want to go. God has released them to go into their sin, and the result of that we see at the end of chapter 1 is this, if you will, just this large soup of sin that is seen. You see it starting in verse 28. "And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind. And I talked about that 2 weeks ago, what the debased mind means, moral insanity. They did not even understand the difference between right and wrong. And we see that in our world today. People that will call something bad good, and they'll call something good bad. That is moral insanity to do that. That is what it means when it says a debased mind. It says He gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. And then there's all these sins. They were filled with unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. And I went through a couple of weeks ago and we listed each one of those and what those words mean. Then in verse 32 it says, though they knew God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but they give approval to those who practice them. So that's the height of evil, is the person who says, not only is this good thing, not only is this bad thing good, but I'm going to give approval to someone who does it. So that was the height of evil. At least that's what we thought, because that's where we ended the chapter. We ended the chapter in chapter 1 and we said, boy, that's the height of evil, moral insanity. That's the height. That's as far as you can go. That's as bad as you can get. Is someone who looks at something that's evil and calls it good. Man, that's the tip of the iceberg. That's as bad as anyone could ever get to. And then Paul looks at us and he says, you're wrong. There's a step further down. You see, we think that's that's as bad as someone can get. To look at something that's bad and say that it's good, that's moral insanity. That's as bad as anyone can get. But this leads to chapter 2. And chapter 2 focuses on a new group of people who are worse than the first. How you like that? We thought we got to the bottom of the rung, didn't we? We thought we got to the tip of the iceberg in sin. But no, now chapter 2 is going to show us a whole new group of people who are even worse than those in chapter 1. Because chapter 2 focuses on self-righteous people. Chapter 2 is focused on people who feel like they don't deserve judgment. And let me say this. Most people feel relatively moral. We've talked about this before, right? If I go up to 99% of the people and I say, hey, are you a good person? They're going to say, yeah, I'm a good guy. And the thing is, anybody who reads Romans chapter 1, they normally agree with Paul. They say, boy, that sure is some bad stuff. Murder, deceit, wickedness, lying, thieving, covetousness. And he goes on. And they'd look at that and they'd say, right on, Paul. Those liars, those perverts, and especially those homosexuals, they deserve to be punished. That's what they'd say. But then you get to chapter 2, and it's like Paul anticipates that. Because he begins to speak to directly those people who would stand above that and say, yeah, they deserve to be punished. But not me. You see, that's the key to chapter 2. The key to chapter 2 is understanding that there are people who look at sinners and they say, they deserve to be punished, but not me. They are bad, but I am good. They're going to hell with gasoline shoes on. But I'm okay. You see, chapter 2 is focused on the self-righteousness. It's focused on this. If you look at chapter 1 and you say, yes, chapter 1 is full of reprobates, Paul sticks his finger in your face and says, you're no better. That's the key. That's the key. Paul puts his finger right dead on the tip of our noses and he says, you are no better. Why? Because he's headlong trying to get to chapter 3. What is in chapter 3? The statement, there is none righteous. He's trying to get us to understand no one is above needing the grace of God. No one is above needing the mercy of God. Everyone is a sinner who deserves to go to hell and needs to be saved. That's the point. And if you look at Romans 1 and you say, yes, those people are bad and surely they deserve the wrath of God, but I am good and do not, then you need to read chapter 2. Because it was written for you. So tonight what I want to do I'm not going to exegete the text, and I know I normally do. I normally exegete, and we go through one verse at a time, and I'll be reading through, and we'll look at the Greek and some of the original language stuff. But tonight we're going to do different. Tonight we're going to look at the whole chapter. Next week I'll begin to break it down verse by verse. Next week we'll look at some of the Greek and all that. But tonight I just want to look at the overview of chapter 2. I'm going to read it to you, and I want to ask you to do this for me. I want to ask you to listen. Novel idea. No, I want to ask you to listen, because what I'm going to be reading is not in your pew Bibles. And it's not going to be in anybody if they brought a Bible with them. I'm going to be reading a paraphrase. No, trust me, it's going to be okay. I normally don't use paraphrases. I don't like them. I like to get to the original Greek language and from there as close to the English as we can get. But tonight, I found a paraphrase I think really grabs hold of what Paul was trying to say. And I think if we listen intently with our hearts, with our ears, listen with your heart, but you get what I'm saying? You listen with your ears, hear what he's saying. I think this paraphrase really grabs hold of the intent of Paul's writing in Romans 2.